Hello, Mr. Franks. Thank you for joining us here at the Money Channel.
My pleasure.
Mr. Franks, what are the latest news from the IMF regarding Romania?
Well, the board met this morning to discuss the fourth review of the program, the fourth review of the program, and the decision was to approve the review. That was not particularly a surprise, considering that all of the performance criteria and indicative targets were met for this review. The board is broadly supportive of the efforts that Romania is making and of the progress that has been made. They are, of course, cautioning in the future that continued diligence in applying the program objectives is going to be very important because the uncertainties in Europe are still very large.
Are there any indicative objectives modified since your last visit in Romania? I'm particularly referring at the budgetary deficit figure, if it's still 1.9%.
There's been no change in the budget deficit target. This board meeting, of course, was based on the visit that we made to Romania in late January, early February, and at that time we agreed with the authorities that it's too early to discuss any changes in our fiscal plans.
What about the economy, Mr. Franks? Because there are talks about a recession here in Romania if we are looking at what happened in the first 2 months of the year.
Well, at the end of the fourth quarter of 2011, we have the data. It was on a quarter-on-quarter basis slightly negative, but actually that was roughly what we had anticipated because it gave us the year growth of 2.5%, which we had expected. Now, as we go into the first quarter of 2012, of course, Romania has been hit extremely hard by severe weather conditions, and that will undoubtedly have a dampening effect on economic growth. I don't know if it will be negative in the first quarter or not, but it will certainly be weaker in the first quarter than we had originally expected due to the severe weather conditions. Now, if severe weather is the only problem, then we would expect a relatively rapid rebound in the second quarter. So, if growth is negative in the first quarter due to the weather, it would not be something that would be particularly worrisome because once the weather has improved, we would expect that growth to restore. Of course, the situation in Europe is still relatively uncertain, and we are forecasting in the IMF that there is a recession underway in the Eurozone. This is going to keep Romania from growing as quickly as it would like. So to summarize, I would say it's possible there will be negative growth in the first quarter, but we will stick with a forecast of positive growth for 2012 as a whole.
But this forecast doesn't exclude a technical recession that we are going to see at the end of this month.
It's possible. We're not forecasting it yet, but as I said, due to weather conditions, it's possible that growth would be negative in the first quarter. But for this year as a whole, we still see growth on the order of 1.5% positive.
And my next question, Mr. Franks, it's related about the public wages, because since your last visit in Romania, there have been wishes expressed by the president to increase the budgetary wages, the public employees' wages up 15%, and this starting from January 1st. Have you been aware about this intention, and what's your view about this?
Yes, of course, I'm aware of these conditions. Even when I'm not physically in Romania, I do read the press, the Romanian press, and keep track of what's going on, and I receive regular reports, and I'm in regular communication with the government authorities. On this issue of wage increase, what we have always said, and I will continue to stick to that, is when we go for our next visit at the end of the March, beginning of April, we will look at the economic conditions and we will see if any change in the fiscal stance is appropriate. At this stage, it would be premature for me to speculate on that. We have been of the opinion that if there is fiscal space, the government might consider some modest adjustment, such as a modest increase in wages or a modest reduction in social contributions. That remains the case. We have to look and see if there's room, and if there's room, the government will have to decide how best to use that limited fiscal space.
Well, but 15%, does it look like a modest increase?
That's considerably larger than what we had been discussing in the past. We've been looking at something more on the order of increase.
What about the other option expressed by the Romanian Prime Minister to decrease the social contributions up to 5 percentage points? What's your view about this?
Well, again, if there is fiscal space, and I'm not sure that there is, then it will be the decision of the government how best to use that space. Does the government want to use any fiscal space for wages, or does it want to use it for social contributions? Does it want to use it for capital spending? How best do we use the limited budgetary resources that are available? In any condition, whether it's looking at social contributions or wages, the fiscal space available is going to be very limited.
And my next question, Mr. Franks, is probably the $1 million question. Are we going to broke the fiscal responsibility law by increasing modest or not modest the public wages starting January 1st?
Well, as I understand it, in the fiscal responsibility law, there are a couple of provisions that have to do with wages. One has to do with the wage bill, which is the overall amount spent on public sector wages. And that is not supposed to be changed during the course of the year according to the fiscal responsibility law. Now, public sector employment has been declining. So if wages stay unchanged and employment declines, the wage bill would fall. So there may be some limited space within the wage bill, the existing wage bill, to do a modest increase in wages. That would have to be very limited. The other issue, of course, is whether you can make the fiscal responsibility law has some rules about making changes to the budget close to elections, and that was also something that we would like to see respected. So if there are going to be elections in November, the changes would have to come well before that.
Just to make sure that I understand, if the Romanian government decides that it wants to increase the public wages by 15% or decrease the social contributions up to 5 percentage points, do they need your approval? Do they need the IMF, European Commission, and other creditors' approval?
Well, we have a program. We have an agreement between the government, the IMF, and the European Commission. That agreement specifies certain fiscal targets. And if there are changes going to be made in those fiscal targets, then those three parties would have to agree about what those changes would be. Because it's a joint program, we work together, we come to a common view. So the government, of course, has sovereignty to decide what kind of a budget policy it has. But since there is an agreement with the international institutions, there has to also be an agreement about changes in those conditions, those underlying conditions.
Would you have anything against increasing the public deficit from 1.9 to 3% in order to accommodate an increase in public wages?
Well, I think, again, it would be premature for me to speculate on what kinds of discussions we're going to have. We need to look at the situation, the economic situation, and the position of the European Commission and the IMF and the government, and sit down and have some discussions on that. What I would say is the following. There is an agreement right now. The agreement says that the budget deficit will be 1.9% of GDP in cash terms. There has been no request officially from the government to change that target. That target was what was just ratified in the IMF board meeting a couple of hours ago. So at this stage, it would be inappropriate to discuss any changes because no change has been requested and the old target has been ratified.
But the only way that you found out about the Romanian authorities' intentions about the public wages or the social contributions were by press, or you were officially informed by the Romanian authorities about these intentions?
No, I also have very regular official communications as well, both directly with the authorities and also through our office in Bucharest.
So you knew about the intention from other sources than the press?
Well, like I said, I receive information from a variety of sources, including the press, including our office in Bucharest, and including direct communications from the authorities.
Were you surprised by this announcement, Mr. Franks?
I knew that there has been accumulating political initiatives in this area, and so I was expecting that there would be some discussions, political discussions of what was the appropriate wage policy. Let me just say that.
So it's rather a political need or an economic need for such an increase, for such a change in taxes, in your opinion?
Well, obviously, when you make a decision that affects the budget policy, it is both political and it's economic in nature, right? I mean, because the budget is a political document, but it has economic implications. I have no views on the political side of this, but I do have views on the economic side of this. And we need to try to do everything possible to make sure that political decisions that are reached about the appropriate budget policies are consistent with the economic requirements of the country.
And I have one more question about this issue. Do you have the right to veto such increases if you will find in early April that the sources for such an increase won't be there? Do you have the right to veto such a proposal?
No, it's not a question of veto power. It's a question of having a joint discussion and a joint agreement. This is a mutually negotiated and mutually agreed arrangement between the IMF, the EU, and Romania. So any major changes to that would be things that would be mutually agreed as well. Not that one party has a veto and the other party makes a decision, or vice versa. The government is in charge of economic policy in Romania, but as long as it has a joint program with the international community, it has an obligation to discuss and agree on those things.
At the discussion that you had in the IMF board, were there any waivers accorded to Romania? Were there any talks about arrears? I just want to ask you about the official number that means arrears in Romania.
There was no need for an arrears target waiver. So there were no waivers because all of the quantitative targets for this review were met. There was some comments from board members about the importance of continuing arrears reduction, particularly in state-owned enterprises, as being an important element of further economic reform in Romania.
At the end of your visit, we had the figure of 2.9 percentage point of GDP as arrears from the state-owned enterprises. Is this the figure that was inside the board discussions?
Well, we have several different numbers on arrears that we use in our IMF targets. First, there is a target for arrears of the central government and the Social Security system. That is a quantitative performance criterion for the program. Then there is an indicative target on the arrears of local governments. We also keep track of that as well. There is also an indicative target on arrears for certain state-owned enterprises that we are making a specific target on for the program. So those are the three targets that we have. One is what we call a performance criterion, and the other two are what we call indicative targets, which are less binding, but they're indicative of whether the program is on track or not. Now, in addition to that, there's an overall measurement that we try to make of arrears that go beyond just the state-owned enterprises that are specifically monitored under the program. And that's obviously a much larger number.
What about the public debt figure? Because we are looking at about 30% increase in the public, 30% of GDP, the public debt. Is the rhythm of increasing of the public debt in the nature to make us confident that we won't have a spiral upwards regarding the public debt?
Well, the increase in the size of public debt ultimately is going to be determined by the size of the fiscal deficit, right? Mm-hmm. Because a larger deficit means you have to borrow more money and your stock of debt increases. So the fact that the deficit is coming down very substantially from, over 7% to under 2% is a huge insurance policy that the debt is not going to spiral out of control. Now, the government has been very forward in increasing its financing at the beginning of this year to try to secure financing buffers in case there are unexpected negative developments in Europe later in the year. That is not only normal, it's actually a very good thing. So I wouldn't worry too much about any month-by-month fluctuations in the debt stock. Ultimately, if you have a low deficit, your debt is not going to grow as quickly, and your debt-to-GDP ratio will stabilize or even decline. And that's what's going to happen in Romania.
Is the 4 months budgetary deficit buffer accomplished? Is this target accomplished?
I wouldn't want to comment on exactly the size of the buffer. What I would say is that the financing that the government has undertaken in the last 2 or 3 months has boosted significantly its cash buffer reserves, both in foreign currency and also in lei terms. The domestic issues in lei have been much above those were originally programmed, and that gives the government a significant cushion that it can use if times turn bad in the coming months.
Another issue that was subject of the board meeting was the reactivation of the privatization process that Romania assumed in front of the IMF. What about this? What does Romania has to do? What has failed to do till now, and it has to become more urgent in your view?
Well, directors did mention the fact that compared to the original proposals of a year ago, the privatization process has gone less quickly than we had hoped. But we are looking forward to a number of issues of minority or even majority stakes in public companies in the very short future. We know that the first one has already been tendered and offers will be coming in the coming days, and that we expect that there will be additional ones in the coming months.
Because I know next week Romania is preparing to sell the largest company in terms of copper reserves in Europe. I mean, Cupromin. How important is that such a privatization to be done well, to be well prepared, to have all the bills, all the approvals necessary there?
Well, I've been very clear on this with the government that I think it is extremely important that the initial privatization offers that are made are done very carefully and calculated in terms of pricing and characteristics of the offer to make them successful. Because if you start out with a few successful offers, you build up momentum, you build up interest in international markets and in domestic markets for people to want to buy these companies because they see that things are happening in Romania and enterprises are moving into the private sector, and there's money to be made there. If these things are not successful, then it sends the opposite message that Romanian policies are not appropriate, and that the offers are not well done, and then people will find that will be much harder to sell companies in the future. So I have certainly asked the government to do everything possible to try to make these first issues successful. We don't want a repetition of last year's episode with Petrom, for example.
Would you accept some bureaucratic problems ahead of privatization? I mean, missing documents or missing things in the tenders offer. And I'm not referring just at Cupromin that is going to be sold next week, but at other companies.
Well, it's a responsibility of the Romanian authorities to do everything possible to make these successful. We realize that bringing a company to privatization is a very complicated and difficult process. That's why we've asked them to hire privatization advisors, hire legal advisors, and the companies themselves need to do everything possible to make this successful. Now, I know that there may be some people in Romania who don't want these things to succeed and who may not want to do everything necessary for these to be successful. We have to recognize that possibility exists and do everything possible to guard against it. Over 20 million people in Romania should not be held hostage in trying to improve the growth and efficiency of the economy to a few people who don't want these transactions to take place.
One last question about the privatization of Cupromin. What is the urgency for selling such a big mine, such a big reserves, in your opinion?
Well, Cupromin is not one of the major companies' focuses of our program. This is a decision that the government made that it wants to move ahead with Cupromin. But the overall principle, I think, has to be clear. Romania is a country that is not yet completed its transition from a communist economy to a market-based economy. The fact that we have over 700 publicly owned companies still in the state hands suggests that there is more that needs to be done to make the full transition to a market economy. Making the full transition to a market economy will bring greater economic growth, greater prosperity for Romanians, greater exports in other countries' markets, and will bring greater investment into the country. This is what we're trying to achieve with this.
And one more question about the international clouds, let's say, like this. Are they over? Are they? Did they disappear from the sky? The clouds of the international recession or turmoil? I don't know.
Well, I would certainly say that the recent debt restructuring in Greece is a major positive achievement. I would also say that the dark clouds don't look quite as dark as they looked a couple of months ago in terms of the economic outlook. But we are not out of the storm yet. There is still the possibility of considerable turbulence on the horizon in 2012. So we have some good news. Things are not as bad as they could have been, but we're not out of this storm yet.
And my last question, if you have something else to add for our viewers that is very, very important for what is going to come, Mr. Franks.
Well, I think as we move into this election cycle in Romania, what is extremely important, and what I hope that all political parties and people who are voting for all the different political parties will keep in mind, is that good, responsible economic policy is not the monopoly of any political party. All political parties should be supportive of the IMF program and of the responsible management of the public finances that is represented in that program. Just like in every Romanian household, people have to make their expenses balance their income so that they can live their lives with economic security, the country also has to manage itself prudently, not spend beyond its means, and send the signal that it is a country that is well managed in order to attract investment and growth and to make the lives of Romanians better. So what I'm hoping is for a message that we can transcend whatever political disagreements there are and use the democratic process to resolve those disagreements and to elect officials, but to understand that all political parties need to support responsible economic management.
Mr. Frank, thank you very much for joining us here at the Money Channel.
My pleasure.